Do our rights come from government or from God? Senator Tim Kaine has some thoughts.
The statement that our rights do not come from our laws or our governments is extremely troubling.
Now here's Republican Senator Ted Cruz with his rebuttal.
And I almost fell out of my chair because that radical and dangerous notion, in his words, is literally the founding principle upon which the United States of America was created. And if you do not believe me, and you made reference to this, Mr. Barnes, then you can believe perhaps the most prominent Virginian to ever serve, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator. Not by government, not by the Democratic National Committee, but by God."
The sparring match between these two lawmakers really shows how both sides of the aisle are talking past each other today. We're operating from different frameworks of what politics actually is, what the purpose of politics is. Our rights come from God, because if they were to come from government, theoretically, then that government could suspend, remove, cancel out those rights at any point. They would be arbitrary. And that means they're not eternal, they're not protected, they're not sacred. And that's why we in America believe that they are transcendent above whatever party happens to be in power. Let's lock in. Quick refresher for the Gen Z people in the audience who are too young to remember the 2016 election. I was a freshman in college. It was a very tumultuous day, I'll put it that way. Tim Kaine was almost our vice president. He was Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton's running mate. He is now the senator of Virginia. Why is that relevant? Well, Virginia is where Monticello is. It's where Thomas Jefferson's house is. Virginia is a very important first colony in the United States where the founding fathers spent a lot of time discussing, hashing out what would become the foundation of our democratic republic. One of those things, one of the pillars that they made, specifically Thomas Jefferson, Virginia resident, was the Declaration of Independence. Tim Kaine, again, senator from Virginia, is showing his obliviousness on our founding. And he was almost our vice president. And honestly, this asks the question, if you don't believe in the same foundation of government, that being consent of the governed, and the consent of the governed comes from the fact that we all get our rights from God, then how are you supposed to legislate on any matters? Any matters, including ones that are of moral human dignity. That would include when life begins, the moment of conception, on abortion, on euthanasia, on anything. So I guess Tim Kaine just believes that someone can just invent your rights. Whoever's in power just decides to bestow them on you, so it's subject to the whims of the ruler. Our founding fathers, on the other hand, believed that these rights were inalienable, they were universal, and they were given by God. The Bill of Rights was just an extra precaution. It was just a document that was specifying so no one could ever debate, no one could ever dispute that we had freedom of religion and press and expression and assembly. It was just an extra fail-safe, like, by the way, here it is clearly enumerated, and we're seeing the perils of not enumerating that in places like Great Britain, where there's restrictions on free speech now that are akin to some authoritarian regimes. And speaking of authoritarian regimes, Tim Kaine had something else to say. He thought he was making a good argument. Here's what he said.
The notion that rights don't come from laws and don't come from the government, but come from the Creator, that's what the Iranian government believes. It's a theocratic regime that bases its rule on Shia law and targets Sunnis, Baha'is, Jews, Christians, and other religious minorities. And they do it because they believe that they understand what natural rights are from their Creator.
So you might be seeing how Tim Kaine is warning that theocratic regimes that are based on religion, could invoke divine right in order to oppress their people. And I totally see where he's coming from, because the Iranian regime is an Islamist, fundamentalist theocracy that does practice Sharia law. It's very strict about that. It does not acknowledge any other religions. It doesn't have freedom of religion. But actually, the political theorists whom the American founders relied upon, especially John Locke, address this directly. Locke lived during a time of 4 Stuart kings in England, James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II, who all claimed that their right to rule came from the divine right of God. But in his 2 treatises, John Locke refuted this idea of the divine right of kings. He said that a monarch's power is not divinely granted, but comes from the consent of the governed to protect natural rights such as life, liberty, and property. So he contended that a government's authority is actually conditional. If the people decide that this government has violated their rights, they can rise up and eject whoever's in power, theoretically. And that is exactly what the revolutionaries in America did in the 1700s to overthrow Britain. So there's a very key distinction here. The people's natural rights come from God, but the ruler's right to rule does not come from God. That ruler has that ruling authority and ability because the people grant it to them. That's what the consent of the governed is. People assemble and they create a government. In America's case, it was a democratic republic with a Congress, with 2 chambers, with an executive branch. The people decided to give that government power. And why do the people have that power in the first place? Because they have natural rights given by God. A lot of communist regimes throughout history, whether that's Venezuela, that's the Castro brothers, Cuba, the Soviet Union, they were very atheist. They prohibited or restricted the practice of religion because they felt threatened by anyone believing in the population that their allegiance belonged to anything but the state, that God could come before the state. And this is why they were able to violate people's natural rights so often, is because they believed that they could just snap and take away their natural rights because they were not from God. Historically, Republicans and Democrats agreed that our rights come from God. They all believe that a benevolent creator was presiding over America in hard times and in good. That doesn't mean we have an established religion in America. We clearly do not, although we have a Judeo-Christian foundation and freedom of religion, so everyone is at liberty to practice whatever they want. But just a few examples for you. Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, this nation under God, FDR's letter on religion and democracy. Upon the Spirit of God shall our democracy be founded. Calvin Coolidge, former president, felt very similarly, and this is just a taste. Bill Clinton, Democrat, probably our last conservative Democrat. He said in his final State of the Union address that our founders pledged us to be one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So this is common knowledge for both parties, literally up until, I guess, Tim Kaine. Both sides believed that faith in a divine power was necessary to sustain a free republic, for civil society, to foster good citizens, good individuals. They viewed it as necessary for virtue, and they didn't think we could honestly function if we failed to see ourselves as one nation under God. It's dangerous that the sitting senator of Virginia, let alone any sitting lawmaker in the United States, would profess this dangerous idea. It shows an unbelievable ignorance of our founding principles. Our channel is booming thanks to you. I'll be traveling for a couple of weeks, but in my absence, we're going to be renovating the studio. Thank you so much for all of your support so far. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and sign up for notifications so you don't miss a single video.